China Institute. It's a delight to welcome you for what promises to be a very interesting discussion tonight. First, a big thank you for coming in, for putting up with everything that's going on. We're still in our foyer, but yesterday when I got back, really good news from the city of New York. We are approved, so the space downstairs and the space in the back, soon before you know it, you're going to be able to see banging away, and we'll be able to expand into another 12,000 feet of square feet, including the space behind. Very exciting. But just as I'm reminded, the next thing I'm going to say is, in addition to Peter's lovely wife Francine, who I saw in the back, hi.
Hi.
We are joined by two long-standing trustees, Yvonne Wong, Sophia Sheng, and my latest corporate trustee, Mike Krupa. So a big shout out, welcome to, thank you for joining. And if you want a more in-depth, Sophia looks after our building committee, but it's really good news. We're so delighted to be getting the support locally, both from government and from individuals and foundations. Anyway, you didn't come here to listen to me. You came to listen to our fourth trustee, who's sitting on the stage here, Peter Walker, who has a very distinguished career that doesn't really need an introduction by me. Although I will start off with something. What we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion. I'm going to start off the discussion and ask a couple of questions up front to help bring out some of the major points that Peter's trying to make in his book. And then we'll open it up and we'll have a casual, what I said, fireside chat. Somebody called it a fireside chat. No fire. We hope that it's nothing incendiary, but hopefully a stimulating conversation. So I just wanted to start it off and then I'll sit down because I found the opening to Peter's book really, really interesting. Sorry for the age, I have to do this. It said, my first connection to China was a spiritual journey over 35 years ago. I wanted to identify with and learn from the lives of individuals who died with a smile. That journey took me east to Taoism and the Tao Te Ching, written by Lao Tzu in the 6th century BC. Now, we're not in the 6th century BC, so since then I've taken over 80 trips to China, connected with hundreds of individuals, Chinese business executives, managers, regulators, government officials, experts, a wide range of social and economic fields, and many individuals interested in Taoism. So I think this evening we're going to explore lots of interesting topics and open it up to you, and then maybe get back and understand a little bit about the meaning of life via the Tao Te Ching.
I am going to ask you to use the microphones because we're
Can
filming.
you hear me, guys?
We're filming, so it would be good if you use the microphones
Okay.
because we're filming.
For posterity.
Yes.
It's a good thing to know what I just said was totally off the record.
I'm very sympathetic with Linda because the last event she ran, which was outstanding, included a distinguished 85-year-old professor who conducted the entire conversation with a microphone at his ankle.
So Pete's going to hold the mic.
I'm not the young guys.
And I taught for too long, so I'm used to booming and projecting. So, let's move away a little bit from that very philosophical introduction and come to one of the first things that struck me when I was reading your book. And it said something like this, quote, China will remain a strong, single-party government with unlimited scope. And I talked back and thought about, China's going to remain a strong, single-party government with unlimited scope. And I thought to myself, that's kind of a little bit different from the perceived wisdom that we get from all of the China experts here in the United States. And I'm just going to do one more line and then I'll do to Peter. And I said, if there's one thing that China Institute stands for and has stood for 95 years, is the fact that China and the US don't have to agree on everything. There's lots of things where we're going to have difference of opinions. But one thing is very true. That is, China and America are probably the two most important countries to occupy this planet. And it behooves the entire inhabitants of this planet to figure out a way to collaborate on the issues that we can collaborate on and be frank about the issues that we have difficulties with. So in that vein, I'm hoping I can turn it over to you now, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you meant about that particular line.
Well, I'll step one step back because having made those 80 trips to China, one of the things that became apparent to me is the way China was described in the Western press, so I'm thinking largely New York Times, the FT, The Economist, bore no relationship to the China that I came to know. And that was really what got me, A, agitated initially, and then finally I was with well, he was the Ambassador General to New York, and I had about 3 lunches with her, and she said, Pete, every time we have lunch you complain about the press, why don't you write a book? So it was really the disconnect between what I saw, because what I read was corrupt government officials, unhappy and oppressed people with no freedom and rights, a government that was mired in corruption and was not particularly effective at delivering for the people, and my experience was completely the opposite on all of those counts. So I set out to write the book. So I started the book with, it was kind of in the spirit of, if you don't buy these things, then you probably don't want to read the rest of the book because it's going to be a little tedious. So yeah, so if you go back to China, China has had a centralist government going back thousands of years. And when you read history, what it always says is that the government serves at the behest of the people. And whenever the government let people down, either overtly, in terms of high taxes and other problems or invasions, or maybe some bad luck in terms of famines and other things that led to a change in regime, but what never changed was the model. The model was always a centrist government. And the way I describe the model of the Chinese government is, ironically, it's an ideal corporate model that was invented in the US. So you have a board of directors called a standing committee, and to some extent the Politburo, that oversees and provides direction. You have the equivalent of a chief executive or president, President Xi, who is a decision maker, but in much more of a consensus-driven way. You raise people up through meritocratic processes and examinations, which is exactly what you do in great corporations. You have short and long-term plans, and you track progress against those plans. So the first time I really became familiar with the government, I said, you know, having spent 46 years at McKinsey, this is a corporate model, exactly. And the other thing that's a significant difference between the US and China, the US was always founded on the idea that we're going to be defined by our economy and our businesses. And the founding fathers started day one with the idea we do not want government interfering in our businesses. And you know, and there have clearly been exceptions, and obviously a lot of chief executives would say too much regulation and too many taxes, etc. But by and large, the amount of freedom is enormous. And the net effect is the best and the brightest in the US go into business. They don't go into government. In China, it's exactly the opposite. The best and the brightest, going back to Confucian days, always go into government service. That's the highest calling. So when you meet people, and having met many government people, you come away very highly educated, very global, very focused on getting things done, and very focused on the people.
So that's a very astute perception. And I'm wondering if I take it a step further. I recently did an hour-long interview with a former US ambassador to China, Stapleton Roy, and he talked a bit about the US government's concept that as China developed, it would emerge and become a more multi-party democratic system, the way we think about multi-party democracy in the US. And I think the people that have that vision in place are seeing that that's not true.
Yes.
And my question to you is that okay?
Yeah, I think it's totally okay. I mean, I think America, by and large, has a fairly romantic notion of democracy. It's very interesting when you go back to read Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and he talks about Thomas Jefferson, who really was the primary driver behind the Constitution. And he basically said, we want all of the informed, educated people to vote and express their point of view. And that was defined, and I am not going to defend this, because I have 4 daughters, male, white landowners. And that was the definition of who could vote. Well, if you look at the way the Communist Party works in China, that's not a clean surrogate, but the spirit of it is there are many highly educated people who are in the government. So if you look at the way our model works de facto, 40% of the people don't vote. We have an electoral college system where basically 2/3 of the country's votes don't matter because they live in a forever red or forever blue state. And therefore, the notion of democracy as the will of the people and an expression on real issues, I find very romantic and not that real. And when I talk to Chinese people, they're very aware of that reality behind it. So the notion that we should go off in that direction. And then the other thing I'd say is, you know, in my visits up until 2008, there was a lot of respect for America on pretty much everything, and certainly financial management. But when we had the crash in 2008, there was a sea change in the people I talked to who were sitting here in China. And they basically said, we don't believe you have control over your financial system, and we're going to be basically going in our own direction. So I think they've been pretty informed about the realities of democracy. Now, I will also say, because Francine loves to say, Pete, do not come across as a panda hugger, which is totally fair. But, you know, what I try to do in the book is to lay out each of the two models and absolutely believe that the U.S. model, against what it set out to do, has been incredibly successful. And for all the griping in the U.S. about nothing gets done in Washington, that was by design. It was designed to be a minimalist government. So let's have two parties who fight each other all the time and get very little done. Let's have three branches that have to agree before anything gets done. Let's have an election every 4 years, so if we're unhappy with a leader, we can push him out. And all of that was by design so that the economic model driven by private enterprise capitalism could rise to the fore. And by any measure, the U.S. has been the strongest country in the world for 150 years, which is an amazing run. So you know, I'm more biased in the sense that I think we are overly critical of China and not very objective of China in terms of who they are and how they work. And I think China has an enormous amount of respect for what the U.S. has accomplished over a long period of time, but basically says, don't impose your model on us. We're different people, we're Confucian, we're not, you know, the rough and ready colonists who started the U.S.
That's fascinating, and you know, I lived in China for 33 years, and I've always said the one thing that you elucidate, and I encourage anybody who hasn't read this book to really pick it up. It's an easy read. It really sets things up in a way that's easy to understand. And one of the basic premises really is that there's a parallel system. System operates, that's what you said, remember, it's equal, but it's different. But in many ways, it's parallel. So, you know, the basis upon which governance develop is different. And the question that I want to ask you, said now a lot of bad coverage about China. I mean, I personally spend a lot of time thinking, you know, people don't trust China. Americans in the West feel very uncomfortable with a lot of things that China does. We're going to get to that in a second. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that the system that China's following now has certainly enjoyed tremendous success. So much success, particularly on the economic side, of lifting people out of poverty, that China feels that it can now export this model as an alternate system to other parts of the world through One Belt, One Road. And I'm curious if you really think that it's Americans that object to the system because the system is intrinsically troubled, or because America's own system is being challenged, and America's own system may not enjoy the same kind and level of success that it has for the past 150 years, and basically it feels threatened.
Yeah, well, I think there is definitely that. I think if you've been number one for 150 years, the idea that there's even a number two chasing at your heels is off-putting to a lot of people. But I would disagree on one thing, James, and that is whenever I was in China with senior people and used the word model, I was always corrected. And I've seen I think One Belt, One Road, from my point of view, is a purely economic play. In other words, China is basically saying, we have excess capacity and global expertise in infrastructure. The developing world needs our infrastructure. They have the energy and minerals that we need. And as they've done in Africa, they've created a win-win. So if you look at the polling of the African people and say, how do you feel about Europe in relation to China? And they'll take China all day long.
So then how do you respond to all of the reports that we see that One Belt, One Road is just what China used to call itself, hegemony, that this is no different than colonial era mercantile system that's going in to take economic advantage of the rest of the world to benefit the rise of China?
Yeah, but first of all, I totally disagree with that point of view, because I think the reality is China made some mistakes on One Belt, One Road. So I think it set itself up for criticism when it didn't do enough financial due diligence and allowed countries to dig financial holes that were unsound. And then they took over a port, I think in Sri Lanka, they've done some other. But Xi was very clear not that long ago where he basically said, look, we've changed and we're going to be screening all One Belt, One Road projects on two dimensions. One is financial soundness, and then the second is environmental sustainability. But you know, one of the things about the Chinese model is that, to me, is more like a corporate model, is the Chinese are incredibly pragmatic and they're very adaptive. And so if you look at the rate at which the major cities in China were being polluted, and they listened to the people, and the people were very noisy about what it was like walking outside in Shanghai, and especially in Beijing. And you know, the last, I say, 10 trips I've taken, it's a sea change. It's got a long way to go, and it's selective in terms of certain cities with their population centers. But One Belt, One Road, you know, I think they've only put to work 50 billion of the trillion they said they were going to commit to. And you know, I think the Chinese are pragmatic, and so are they going to do everybody's deal the way they want to do it? No. Or are they looking to impose a Chinese model that's 2,000 years old? I don't know how you'd even think about doing that in most developing countries, because the leadership tends to be unstable, and you don't have anything like the traditions. I mean, a huge advantage China has is Confucian values go back, you know, to 600 BC, and they are very alive. When I talk to young people in China, family first, society second, and individual third, it's kind of like, of course that's the way it works. That's the way it's always worked. Self-improvement as an individual through education, absolutely the #1 priority. Modesty, you know, I talked to Mr. Zhao, who was the former deputy mayor of Shanghai, and I said to him, I said, you know, China's a really interesting story. Why don't you guys tell your own story? And he said, well, there's two reasons. The practical one is we're not very good storytellers. But the other one, he said, you know, when you're raised under Confucian values, you do not talk about yourself. And we're just not comfortable doing it. So we need you to go right away.
Glad you did. You know, one of the things that I liked most about Pete's book was he took on some of the conventional sort of perceived wisdom and also some of the most controversial and difficult to address subjects, and took them on straight on and head on. So two of those I'd like to bump on. One is rule of law and the other is media. These are areas where Westerners have a particularly hard time with China. And you talked about the rule of law. I'm just trying to remember what you said. Is steadily taking hold by the judiciary. But the difference is the judiciary is not an independent judiciary. It's accountable at the end of the day to the CCP. So my question to you is, if Westerners here try to absorb that, how do you negotiate the fact that there's, you say, developing rule of law, yet at the same time it's not an independent judiciary?
Well, first of all, anyone who has followed Supreme Court rulings for the last 10 years and the appointment process in the U.S. would describe it as 90% political. right? I mean, it really is, so there's no getting around it. You can pick out any issue and you could go right down the line on the 5 conservatives and the 4 liberals, and here's how they're going to vote. So neither side has an independent judiciary in that sense. I think it's really too bad, because I do think the Supreme Court, if you were to go back 25, 30, 40 years ago, really had deliberation in the true sense of the word. But it'll be interesting when we get to Roe versus Wade and some of the other controversial issues. You know, my instinct is they're going to line up in highly predictable ways. Rule of law is interesting. So Mao officially put it in until he realized that it got in the way of him doing what he wanted to do. So there really was no rule of law in any practical sense until Deng took over. So that was only 40 years ago. And the problem was there were no lawyers, there were very few lawyers, there were no law schools, there were no judges. So, you know, they built up fairly steadily the rule of law, but there's some very fundamental differences. You know, one of the most fundamental differences that really led me east in deciding in my spiritual journey, I was an Easterner, I'm not a Westerner, is the West is very dualistic. So the phrases you hear are winners, losers, heaven, hell, good, evil. Okay, and that has been part of the West forever. And I'm not judging, I'm just saying it is what it is. But the East is much more balance and harmony. So, for example, when you look at the rule of law in China, there's very little litigation that actually goes to a final decision. That 95% of what happens is settled through mediation. And so going back to the importance of what the Chinese call guanqi, which is relationships, it's much more based on trust. We've grown up in an adversarial legal system where you have contracts and the rule of law and complexity. So I went to my lawyer and said, hey, I need a new estate plan. And I said, and I wrote one for the prior lawyer, and he said, it's way more complicated than that. And I said, well, let me tell you what I think. I said, here's the estate, I got 4 daughters, here's how I want it carved up, and here's when they can get access to it. That fits on a page. To make a long story short, I finished the process with my new lawyer about 4 months later, and about 300 pages. And it was all required because who made the rules? The lawyers. So, and China's not into that. China is very much into the notion of trust is extremely important, but it has to be a two-way street. So, you know, I always tell Americans who complain about their joint ventures in China, I said, look, China is very clear. They will always do what's in their best interest. And as long as you know that's the way the world works, you can react to it. So I always tell a joint venture partner, if you think you can go in and share all of your IP and they owe you, you're mistaken. Because there's no, the word fair doesn't even exist, I don't think, in the Chinese language. But on the other hand, if you understand that's the rule of the road when you deal with China, then you basically go in and you make sure that your partner needs what you are bringing to the table. And you will have a very constructive relationship on that basis. But rule of law has a very different meaning in China. And I think the notion that, you know, we spend as a country 5% of GDP on litigation and lawyers. And that is more than we spend on all research and development. And so, you know, you have to ask yourself the question, is that a model that you would necessarily want to emulate? And I'm not saying we shouldn't have a vibrant legal practice, but we ought to be very clear from a societal point of view what the value added is. And I think we've gone past that.
And without being judgmental, Peter, I mean, I think everybody in this room reserves the right to figure out and determine which system is appropriate for where. But if we don't understand the system that's operating in China, we're all at a disadvantage. And that's why it's so important. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but to walk away and saying, well, there isn't a system, and there isn't a rule of law, that's not true. You may not agree with it, but there is definitely something in place, right? The other area that I wanted to do, and then I promise I'll open it up because I know people, this is meant to be an interactive discussion. I'm just meant to kick things off. So I just want to just ask one more particularly tough question, and that is, and we could spend all night here, about media. And if we look at, you mentioned about what you read in the reports here about what's happening into China. And personally, this is one of the things that startled me most. If I read what was happening in China, and what I always plead with people to do is, go have a look. Go spend some time. Go talk to people in the streets, go to school, go to work with them. But if you read the media here, I think you walk away with a very different impression of China than you do if you're actually in China experiencing it. And I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about that, and I will give my thoughts, but I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that. How did that happen? Do you perceive it the same way that I am?
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the real, I mean, if I could pick one fundamental difference between the U.S. and China that overrides all others, the U.S. going back to the founding fathers had no economic freedom other than class-driven opportunities in Europe. So if you were not born to the upper class in Europe, the economic opportunity was not open to you. Secondly, religious freedom and human rights were not open to you. So when the founding fathers sat down, what they optimized was individual rights and religious freedom and economic opportunity and economic freedom, all focused very much on the individual. And if you go back to Christian and Judeo beliefs, the notion of everyone is a child of God, everyone is special, and everyone needs to be respected, in a very fundamental way. China is a collectivist society. So if you go back to what I said about Confucianism, number one is the family. And family bonds in China are quite amazing when you actually talk to kids about saying things literally like, I would never disappoint my parents, ever. And not said as a throwaway phrase, but just something very genuine. And the parents' commitment to the kids and their future. And then society is second. So when you talk to about individual rights in China, you're already starting with something where people say, well, what do you mean? So when you ask people about, well, how do you feel about all the surveillance that's going on? And they basically say, well, crime's going to go down. So, again, it's not a right or wrong, and if you grow up in America, that's not a good answer. But it's not an irrational answer if you basically, and so when you go to the press, what the government is basically saying is, we don't want anyone doing anything that is going to undermine the legitimacy of the government. We are here for the people. We brought 800 million people out of poverty. We have the highest approval rate of any major country around the world. And when you talk to people, when you look at the celebration of the 70th anniversary, there were not a lot of actors there. Those were people who were genuinely enthusiastic about what the government's been able to do. So when you look at freedom of the press, I think, most people say that anything that is viewed as stirring the waters in terms of challenging the legitimacy of the government and what it's trying to do is not going to be acceptable. Now, my personal feeling is that in the last 5 years, that definition has been taken to a level that goes beyond common sense. That the level of sensitivity to what you can and cannot say. And I had a section in my book on Tiananmen, and I talked to my Chinese publisher. He said, Pete, that's not going to stand. I said, I totally understand that. But I said to him, the common view in America is that Tiananmen was about a countrywide outcry for democracy / American electoral. And when you look at the history of Tiananmen, it had nothing to do with that. The students were very upset because a very beloved senior government official had been demoted by Deng, and they recently had his funeral, and they wanted to express their support for him. And then you had the lifting of price controls and inflation and hoarding, and that affected everybody's pocketbook, and they were very upset about that, and they were upset about corruption. But it wasn't until the troops actually came in that it turned into a democracy, which became a surrogate for we are very unhappy with what the government is choosing to do. And so, from my point of view, if the press could tell the Tiananmen story in a legitimate way, people would understand it. And you talk to the young people, and most of them have found out a way to figure out what was actually going on. So the whole press censorship, you don't get much pushback in China from it because A, on the internet, everyone's got their VPN and they can figure out how to get around it. And what's actually not okay in the press are things that they say fall under the heading of sensitive subjects, and as long as we feel overall the government's doing a good job for us, we're okay with that as a compromise. And again, I don't agree that the way the lines are actually being drawn on those things, but I can understand the point of view they're coming from.
So I think what you've touched on, and I'm going to open it up right after this, is something that's really at the core and the heart of things, because I think that if we're really going to be smart, we have to think about and try to understand the way Chinese people metabolize and digest the situation. I don't think we can really sit here and say, I mean, for many people in America, the lack of freedom of press, those sensitive subjects, is at a core issue really difficult for Americans to digest and accept and say, developed economies, developed societies don't muzzle people. And I think what you've just described is a little bit about the way China and Chinese people deal with the reality of how media operates in China. And at the very least, I think it's really important for us to understand that people aren't taking to arms because of that. You don't have to agree with it, but I think that you need to understand and try to put yourself in the shoes to see how people receive it there. That's how, by the way, I think it's going to be a long-term point of contention, because I think that it represents a very different worldview. I think it represents a very different place of how people think about what media's role is in their society. But like I said, what we're here about is not to advocate for one side, but to make people at least aware of how a large population thinks about it. Okay, so enough from me. I think, why don't we open it up if any of you have any questions that you'd like to raise or think about. Pete, there's been a lot of controversial subjects here and controversial topics. If any of you'd like to have a question, let me start around. When I saw his hand in the back first, so why don't we go to that and then we'll walk around.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. Hello, thank you so much for coming. My name is Joey. I'm a master's student at Columbia SIPA, and thanks again for your participation in the China and the World Forum. So my question is on Chinese nationalism. How do you observe the changing landscape of today's nationalism in China? As I see most of my friends are turning more nationalistic on China, like our military is stronger, our economy is stronger, and in the wake of separatism in Hong Kong and Taiwan, some of those nationalism transform into more hostile approach to the people, and that can spill over to the international sphere. So how do you observe that, and how do you think that would impact the future China and U.S. relations?
Yeah. Well, if you go back in time, China has certainly played out appropriately as a big deal what they've done in bringing people out of poverty. And in fact, Xi has already declared that they now want to go out and remaining, I believe it was 40 million people roughly. So I think nationalism in part kind of becomes part of the next storyline. And you have to remember that when you go back and look at the education process in China, the century of humiliation, which we described as, how many years ago was that? That's taught constantly in China. So if you go back, and I'll just recount some of the components of it, but basically the British, the Europeans, and the Americans basically enforced the opium trade in China, created somewhere estimated to be about 4 million addicts, and it was because England, which took the lead, had a significant balance of payments problem because they were importing so much tea from China. And they were just looking to solve the problem. But the irony is opium was illegal in England. So if you think about gunships being set up the Yangtze River in the Qing dynasty, which was not Chinese, it was Manchurian. And so you had the forced opening of ports, and then you had war with the Japanese at the end of the 19th century, and then other Japanese invasions. So there's a long history of subjugation, and I think a lot of Americans love to put a spin on that and say, well, we've been a good friend of China for a long period of time. I think if you have their view of history and look at it in a balanced way, it doesn't exactly work out that way. So nationalism is something that's part of the way individuals are raised, and they're also raised to have a great deal of pride. So those of you who saw the opening ceremonies of the 2008 Olympics, everybody was, wow, how in the world did they do that with that many people? And we tend to put a spin on it and say, well, they were probably forced to do it. That's not my take. 80 trips later, they're genuine, the pride is absolutely genuine and it's real, and they celebrate it, you know, in everyday life. So nationalism, I think, in part becomes the government's next source of value added. Obviously, it has to be done in a thoughtful way, and I think it can be pushed too far and make big deals out of little deals. And Hong Kong and Taiwan are fundamentally different, but you know, if you put yourself in the position of a mainland Chinese, where you lived through a civil war costing tens of millions of lives, the Great Leap Forward, 30 million died of starvation, the Cultural Revolution, Hong Kong, meanwhile, was a thriving Western community. So when it was finally turned back to China officially in 1997 for the first wave, the protests that are coming up from the students now, and I admit the Hong Kong government / Chinese government did not handle it well. So leading with, we want the right to be able to extradite you to China, that was not a really smart thing to do, and has since been withdrawn. But you have to put yourself in the shoes of the Chinese mainland, and they basically say, if you look at what we have lived through and how we define a tough day, and how these students who are now saying, well, we think we ought to be able to do democracy exactly the way we like, that's, first of all, it's never going to happen, because face in China is an enormous issue. And so whether it's going to be handled with force or not, I'm a very strong believer that the Chinese are the ultimate pragmatists. They will never forget, as a government, Tiananmen, and I don't think you're ever going to see force being used. But what's going to happen is they're going to allow Hong Kong to atrophy economically if they don't get their act together. And I think then with a couple weeks ago, they pulled 500 of the top people from Hong Kong together and said, look guys, this is your game. Shenzhen, as an example, is about 4 times the economy of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a special role. We, as Chinese, would love to maintain that role. But if you can't keep the airport open and keep students from Molotov cocktails and physical destruction over time, Hong Kong is going to become a less important part of China. And you've got to decide what you want to do about that. And Taiwan, I think, is going to be the same. Taiwan, ultimately, it makes no sense for China to do other than allow mainland China to become so fundamentally important to Taiwan, which is pretty close to that already, that the Taiwanese basically say, well, this is kind of silly. Why don't we become part of the model?
Very, very perceptive. I might add, though, just one comment. I think that your comments and perception about nationalism were smack on, except I don't think it's the next phase. I think it's here. I think it's front and center, and that sense is already palpable, and I think America better get to grip and understand how Chinese feel about China.
Yes.
Hi, would you mind putting on a few, I'm so sorry, thank you, Ava Chian. Would you mind putting on a futurist hat? So let's say fast forward 10 years in China. If you know, we all know what China has been, what China is today. Let's say 10 or 15 years. I'm trying to draw a dramatic. Can you point out maybe 3 things that are very, very striking, and some things that we can recognize and some things that we cannot recognize in the new transformative China in the next 10, 15 years?
Well, if I think about the economic engine of China, there are a couple things I'd point to. One is, it's not much talked about in the US, but when you take someone from the rural areas and put them into an urban environment, their productivity increases by a factor of 6. Now there are, and if you look at the productivity growth of China, the vast majority of it is due to urbanization. And China at this point is 58% urbanized. Mature countries like Japan are in the 70s. So there's a lot left. There are going to be diminishing returns over time, but the absolute number is very significant. The second is China is the largest, fastest growing consumer market in the world, and they're really just getting going. So while we tend to think that China is really hurting because of the trade war, the relative economic importance of exports to the US today are a fraction of what they used to be. And given all the degrees of freedom the Chinese government have over currency, inflation, pricing, investment, regulation, they're going to manage through that fine. So the second engine is the consumer side of the equation. And then the third one is both the US and China at very different time periods went from basic farming to much more productive farming to manufacturing, productivity for export and import. And now we're in the age of where it's kind of not a level playing field yet, but it's getting close to that on technology. So the whole 2025 initiative that China should not have come out with as visibly as they did because it got everybody else's attention. Deng would never have done it that way. But if you look at the fact that the percentage of college graduates in China who have degrees in engineering, science, and mathematics is 4 times the percentage in the US, and the population is 4 times. So every year, 16 mathematicians, scientists, engineers are created in China for every one. So if the playing field in the future is technology, which I believe it will be, China has a lot of wind at its back. Now, a lot of people feel threatened by that, but I come back to the idea that I've never seen evidence that China wants to do anything globally other than take advantage of economic opportunities for the benefit of their own people. Their military efforts over the years are lost in the rounding compared to the West. Totally insignificant. So I see a peaceful China. I see a very prosperous China. I think they will increasingly be good world citizens. I look at the One Belt, One Road, and she was very clear when he said we made a mistake when we invested in situations where people couldn't pay us back, and that's not going to happen again. And these projects are going to have to be green. So I see a fairly enlightened, and you don't pick that up from the U.S. press, but if you just step back from understanding how they're wired, it's all consistent with that model.
Pete, there's been, Pete, there's been recent news item about the general manager of the Houston Rockets making a statement in support of the protesters in Hong Kong. And the NBA has come out with a very, I think, very balanced statement regarding support for, the Chinese government. The media in the United States has taken this in kind of a bifurcated way, which I think this is an excellent example of how the media will jump on a story that's, cheerleading kind of an anti-Chinese government sentiment, while, the reality is the NBA seems to be trying to protect their business relationship with the government of China, because obviously it's an enormous market for them. I wonder if you would comment on that a little bit in terms of how that works, and how does the United States move forward, because this is not the only press attack against the Chinese government. How do we move forward into a more collaborative relationship with the Chinese as we move forward in history?
Yeah. Well, part of it is investing in understanding. So I think if everybody simply understood that in a collective society, the well-being of the family and society totally trumps the well-being, pardon the play on words there, the individual. So if you start with that, and if you look at the American business community, they're upset about immigration because they're fine. I mean, to the extent there's illegal immigration and people who are really going to be a drain on the country, I think almost everyone's just saying, we're fine, deal with that in a smart way. But when you start cutting back the visas of really highly educated Chinese, Indian, Eastern Europeans, who've been the backbone of the scientific community in the U.S., which has always been very open architecture. So I think the businessmen, when you look at immigration and when you look at trade, need to be much more vocal and basically saying, this is not in our country's long-term best interest. But I would also turn it around and say to China, China has to just be smarter about where it picks its fights, right? So, you know, when I look at the internment of 1 million Uyghurs, you know, first of all, the number of radical Islam events, terrorism in China, the total number of deaths is probably 50, 60, 70 over the course of the last 15 years. So putting this in perspective, to inter 1 million people, knowing probably 980,000 of them don't even think about terrorism, and then to chant Maoist slogans at them is just not a good use of energy, and it certainly feeds into the Western press. And I think Hong Kong's the same way. I can't believe there wouldn't have been a possibility to put aside extradition, which is an in-your-face kind of way to go at the issue, and basically say, let's listen to the students. We're not going to give you everything you want, but what is it that would make you much more comfortable and cut down the protests? And let's see if we can find a common ground. The Chinese are great negotiators, but you have to have a little bit of give and take to be able to do that. And it has to be done in a way where the West recognizes the importance of face. So when Trump says, for example, this is a quote, if Xi doesn't show up at the G20 and meet with me on trade, I'm raising tariffs the next week. You do that to a Chinese, and that is about as extreme as you can go in challenging, and they will never play that game. And America is constantly pushing them and poking them. Like we had John Bolton, who came out with a wonderful phrase after Hong Kong. We're watching you, and we remember Tiananmen. And if anything happens, there will be consequences. You know what that says to the Chinese government? I mean, that is just so off the charts, it's unacceptable. So there's room on both sides. And because I think the genuine sources of disagreement, if you look at it factually, are relatively inconsequential, other than the fair game, which is economic. And the U.S. is doing what it always should have done. We should have been protecting our intellectual property 10, 15 years ago, but we didn't. And China took advantage of it like any country would when you've got a wide open gate.
Thank you for wonderful comments. So my question relates back to a period during the history of Japan and China when we call 正冷经热. So politics is cold, but economy is hot. So in the work I do and also passion in my life, I've seen one key of building a good relationship maybe between the two countries is how can we find ways to build genuine relationships among the private business people, entrepreneurs? Because I feel like they are not American Chinese, they're just one big community. So what are your advice for current period that we can build such friendship and relationships among those business people across those two countries? Thank you.
Yeah, well, certainly there are things we could be cooperating. I mean, I think if you put aside, you know, Trump's, though I don't believe the science, I think most administrations would welcome genuine cooperation between the U.S. and China on the environment. You know, among the biggest, the polluters that we have in the world, and I think that if you talk to the populations on both sides, especially the young, it's an enormously important issue. But there are others. I think terrorism, we also are on the same side of the table in terms of what can be done about that. The whole notion of clean energy, immigration, another very fundamental issue globally. But I do think the business community, you know, China has been opening up its markets, but I think most people would say very slowly, And, you know, in my world of financial services, and my focus very much on insurance, and certainly a lot of the major insurance companies in China, the Chinese financial institutions are quite sophisticated. I mean, if you look at Tencent and WeChat, their payment system swamps what we have in the US. The same thing with Alibaba and Alipay. So I don't see any reason why the Chinese wouldn't be much more open to letting US companies take bigger positions in a number of areas like that and just let competition go to work. But there are areas like that where they have been slow, and it's unfortunate because, you know, Hank Greenberg, who I adored as the CEO of AIG and totally understood China, he was a master. But he's been very vocal that China has not met its commitments, and we helped China get into the WTO, and there ought to be more movement on that side. And so, you know, it's a little bit like the Uyghur issue. There would be an enormous amount of goodwill if China did some things where the upside would be huge in terms of relations, and the real cost of them would be pretty inconsequential. But I think right now, the whole issue of face around the trade war and around IP, reinforced by the press, has gotten us to the point where even little things become big things. So the common sense areas to compromise are not being taken advantage of.
Great. I'm just keeping an eye if we have time, if anybody would like to ask the last question. Mike, please.
Peter, brilliant book, brilliant presentation. As a leading global expert in financial institutions and insurance, could you comment briefly on your prognosis for the further evolution of China's financial institutional system and framework, and particularly insurance companies, their perhaps revisited global forays after maybe some false starts the last few years?
Yeah. Well, the financial institutions, I mean, the heart of financial institutions are the banks. And the banks, the state-owned banks are really part of the government. In other words, the loans are made at the behest of the government to SOEs and to other people who the government is favoring at a particular point in time. So there are other banks who are not state-owned, but their role is relatively insignificant. My own feeling is that the debt that's been piled up in SOEs long-term, because they generate half the return on capital of the private sector, is probably not a great thing for China, because, and I've worked with a number of SOEs, and they're not very efficient. And the reason is the senior executive decisions and personnel decisions are made by the organization committee of the party. So I remember having a conversation with the CEO, and I said, I won't mention his name, I said, your property casualty strategy is destroying wealth like it makes no sense. I said, I've been doing P&C for 30, 40 years, and everyone who does what you're doing winds up getting the results you're getting. He said, I couldn't agree more with you. I said, so why are you doing it? He said, because the head of the P&C company wants to do it. I said, doesn't he report to you? He said, on paper he reports to me, but the organization committee of the party will decide his next job, and they have a lot more influence than we do. So you've got some natural inefficiencies in the financial institution, especially the banks, but also the insurance company. PICC is an SOE. China Life is an SOE. China Pacific is an SOE. So the company that really has been the trailblazer in China, by a huge margin, is Ping An. Ping An is a superbly run company that runs circles around the domestic companies. And Peter Ma is a great leader. Well, Peter Ma does what great leaders does. He builds a team that completely aligns with his strategy, and if you don't, you're going to be gone. And he doesn't hear from the organization committee of the party on whether somebody can be taken out and somebody else ought to get promoted. So I think before the financial institution is really going to become innovative in a global sense, there has to be more free enterprise introduced into the SOE markets.
Thank you. I want to finish up with one last question, because we started the question about your journey to the East and the search for Taoism. One thing that was on my mind, and curious, what an illustrious career, 48 years at McKinsey. One of the things that I think, Taoism is all about the journey. And I'm wondering if you can share with us in conclusion how it is you got to the point where you were able to encapsulate so much of your career and bring it into a book? What was the journey like to becoming an author?
Well, McKinsey's all about problem solving. And I guess I was fascinated by the challenge of how can you have so many sophisticated, intelligent people in the U.S. know so little about China as the second largest and fastest. I just couldn't understand how that could happen. And I learned a ton by writing this book. So one of the things, I always heard of Confucian values kind of in the background. But when you read the history and realize that it was completely embraced by the Han, the Tang dynasty, the early Song dynasty, and then it was adopted by later emperors because when they took over, always after a change in government that was never an easy process, what did they want? Well, you've got a gigantic population. You want to introduce order. How do you introduce order? Family, society, modesty, hard work, education. So I was very struck that Confucianism has been, and even adopted by the Mongols, because they quickly realized after they took over, they said, there's like 100 of them for every one of us. How are we ever going to manage this? And someone said, Confucianism. But then when you look at the period of time, starting at the end of the Qing dynasty, going through the warlord period, and then through the period of the Civil War, where there really was no society objective function in a classic sense, but family values went all the way through that, and the focus on education, it never was. So I just view Confucianism as so fundamentally grounded in who the Chinese really are, that it will be their bedrock. But there were areas like that writing the book was a lot of fun, because you talk at McKinsey, you can have theories, but you've got to have facts. And so going back and literally looking at the history books and making sense and saying, why did this happen the way it did? And it took me quite a while to understand, why is it that the Chinese are so sensitive about things like Tiananmen and Hong Kong? But when you look at collectivism and you look at the whole history of the century of subjugation, and you could see that while you wouldn't make the calls the way they're being made today, there's an underlying feeling that China needs to be honored and respected as not necessarily an equal, but as a legitimate world player. And they haven't had that respect. So writing was great fun, and I'm going to stay on this subject as long as I'm vertical. So, I've learned a ton by doing it, and it was also great fun because I had my wife Francine, who was my coach, who constantly every morning said, "Don't be a panda hugger." Kimberly, after 46 years at McKinsey, I thought I was a pretty good writer. I gave her the first script, and the first thing she said was, "Dad, I don't know who taught you how to write. If you ever see a sentence with the word 'that' in it, please rewrite it." And then Sarah did a great job running down all the facts and the sources that behind it all. So it was very much a fun family affair. So I'm looking forward to
On that note,
the next book.